Do you know that President Paul Kagame of Rwanda has been in office since 2000? That's 20 years on the saddle, and that's how citizens on the continent make presidents for life. The sad reality that is, but if you look at the Rwanda example, we ask the question, at what point does a dangerous obsession becomes a safe possession? Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. Well, the conversation continues here. Leadership, as you know, is the bane of Africa's development, and like we discussed yesterday, some powers that be may be fueling the continuous stay of presidents to serve their own personal interests. Now, quite contrary to some standpoints, that the third term is not democratic and should not be encouraged. Now, some opinions defend the need to seek the third term. Now, these people believe in restricting leaders from seeking the third term limits voter freedom to choose a candidate of their choice. It also affects the consistency of policies. It leaves development programs unaccomplished and deprives nations of skillful, excellent leaders after the expiration of their terms. One wonders if this is actually tied to the number of years they stay in office, although a school of thought thinks the third term is necessary. We should note that most of the countries facing conflicts today are those without term limits. Most of the countries with the highest number of refugees in Africa, sadly, are those without term limits. So these countries stand high on the corruption index at an average position of 145 of the 180 countries rated. Now, the nature of the ascension of these leaders, especially when military coups are involved, must also be taken into consideration. Uganda, Rwanda, Cameroon, Congo Republic, and many other leaders are products of the military. Now, has democracy taken its place yet in Africa? Joining me again to continue this conversation is Nweke, a global affairs analyst. Many thanks for joining us again today.
My pleasure to be with you, Sulaiman.
Well, reading through some perspectives after our show just yesterday, I discovered that maybe, logical, but an undemocratic defense for the third term. Perhaps let's start, unwrapping this to see if this term limits in general is limiting. Do you think two-term government isn't enough?
One-term government could actually be enough as well. As a matter of fact, one African leader, and I believe it's one state of Nigeria, actually mentioned when there were a whole lot of noise around, re-election or no re-election, he said, well, as a matter of fact, come to think of it, when you seek to resit an exam, it means you didn't do well in the first exam. So as a matter of fact, seeking a second or even a third or fourth term actually indicates that, the person hasn't done well with the time that the person had. But you see, like I mentioned yesterday, my preoccupation is completely different. It is different because I believe very strongly in sustainable development. What I mean by that is, cosmetic changes just for the sake of change, sooner or later is going to collapse. So I would concentrate my efforts more on educating the electorate, on making sure that the Constitution in the first place was right. And then all other things follows. Now, I want to admit indeed that term limitations, 2 terms, is very popular and indeed is winning in acceptance. And I have no problems going for that. But there are other more fundamental underlying issues around democratization, enlightenment of the electorate, and other issues.
You know, there are leaders who just might test the waters and the consciousness of the people by throwing a third-term mandate at them. So between the people and the opposition parties now, who can we really give the more sincere response when it comes to such situations?
Well, more sincere response would have to rest with the people, in my opinion, because politicians in general, on the average, actually are people of a specific kind of character. They are very, very ambitious. There are only very few of them that will actually not be opportunistic when the opportunity actually presents itself to them. There are not a lot of Nelson Mandelas in the world today who will do a term and say, my time is over, it is now time to hand over the baton to a new generation. So I think it is fair to say that you can't quite trust the politicians themselves to be the judge and the jury in this game of politics. And so the onus would have to lie on the populace.
I'm so excited about the perspective you just raised. Out of the blues, you just reminded the continent that there was a man who ran just for one term and he was satisfied till this moment. Everyone and anyone outside the continent still speaks highly of him. While you will condemn Alpha Conde, for instance, for sticking to his seat despite non-performance, you may not say same of Kagame or Al-Hassan Ouattara. So do you think seeking a third term is always down to greed or the need to finish unfinished business? And I want you to also key in the Nelson Mandela example in all of this.
Those who seek third term may mean well. But the point is that we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, I do not buy into the notion that one man is an island, and if that one man doesn't exist in a country, everything is going to collapse. A good leader is that begins from day one to nurture a successor, maybe even two successors. A good leader is that from day one begins to have a succession plan, because come to think of it, anything could happen at any time, and a good leader doesn't leave a vacuum. So, as a matter of fact, it should be something to be left to the leaders themselves, if you have good ones, to determine. But, of course, we do know, like I mentioned earlier, that there is a little bit of rogue element in many leaders that makes it perhaps imperative to actually take the issue of, term limitations seriously. But again, I go back to the fundamental point, which is that ultimately it is the people that the power rests with, and that being the case, the people should at all times be empowered to be able to make the right decision.
But again, we just also have seen how even sometimes when the people say it's a no-no, we've seen leaders, go through the back door sometimes to rejig and tweak the Constitution to give them that, leeway to continue to stay in power. Like in Cameroon, for instance, there's not been any term limit. I still want to look at South Africa, perhaps, Madiba. Tell us what you think was actually responsible for Madiba to have done just a term in office, knowing full well that he would have been able to stay, infinitely as a leader, because he was so much loved by his people and the continent.
Absolutely. At the heart of the decision of Madiba to relinquish power, even at a time when his favorability rating was very, very high, is actually his good-naturedness. He is a true leader who believes in nurturing successors, and he did nurture quite a number of them and eventually gave way. Like I said earlier on, there aren't so many Nelson Mandelas out there. Now, we also know that in the case of South Africa, there is, of course, a term limit one way or the other, even when there is no directly elected president. So Parliament, for example, could actually remove a president, like we saw in the case of the president before, like the immediate past president. So, well, let me make it clearer. I believe that if we concentrate a bit of effort on the quality of individuals that are elected into parliament in the first place, because don't forget that most of the time when a president comes in and uses the constitution to elongate his stay in power, it is usually done according to the books most of the time, I would say. Not all the time, but most of the time. But then you see a whole lot of arm twisting. You see a whole lot of, extrajudicial killings, manipulations, and so on and so forth, which, when they make it to the court, they do not usually succeed, because there is always one word or the other to prove that it's done within the lines of the Constitution. So essentially, I come back to the point that the quality of the legislators who would resist such attempts, like it was done in Nigeria in the case of President Olusegun Obasanjo, and the civil society organizations actually coming out en masse and knowing their onions and standing firm. These are all alternative ways of getting that which serves the people well.
One other sore thing here to note is to think that some of these leaders were actually, young Africans, youth, who started the struggle at a time that we also saw Madiba, fighting, apartheid in his region and in his country. For instance, late Robert Mugabe and a couple of them that are still in power. Perhaps is this some ideological, leaning that we have seen in some of these people, or perhaps there's something, because we're still trying to know the reasons why some of those who were right there in the struggle have just perpetrated themselves without having a leadership recruitment process for people to step on the saddle when the ovation is actually, died down for them to leave.
Yeah. Again, you pointed out earlier on that greed might be one of the things that we're dealing with here. And essentially, that answers the question of those that started well, people like Robert Mugabe, socialists, people-centered policies at the beginning. He eschewed corruption and all sorts of, political vagaries, and was very, very popular amongst the people. But the point is that, the more they stay in power, and again, I have to admit, as much as I am indifferent about, the notion of term limits, questions such as the one that you have just posed actually tilts the balance to, indeed ensuring that there is indeed term limit, because the more they stay in power, the more the tendency to be corrupt, and the more, they are ingrained in the system and, making it much more difficult to live. It is not for nothing, for example, that in the diplomatic practice, that ambassadors posted to a certain place, are meant to spend 3, 4, maximum 5 years, and they are out of that place. And that is to ensure that before they get too cozy, too settled, and begin to compromise, they are out of there. I think the same reasoning might serve politics well, but ultimately the people decide.
Well, we'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll be looking at the kind of democracy we have seen in Africa, whether there is an African-type democracy that the continent should be able to study keenly and see how best it can be something that is much more, fashionable and acceptable by the continent. That's when we return. You're still watching VSA here on News Central Television. African leaders are more likely to challenge term limits than step down voluntarily, as we've seen in some. Sometimes this challenge leads to bloodshed and an opportunity for the military to take over. Recall in 2018, for the first time in Africa's electoral history, law-abiding African leaders surpassed overstayers, that's another name, cumulatively. So between the 1990 and 2019, wait for this, 42 presidents from 31 countries completed their legally allowed executive mandates. Now, these leaders stepped down voluntarily only in 53% of the occasions. Other led to riots and forceful removal from office, as in Blaise Compaoré, former Burkina Faso's president situation, and late Pierre Nkurunziza, who was beaten in the election on his third attempt. Well, I'll still have Collins Nweke with me here, looking at how best we can actually streamline this democracy. And of course, Adeniyi Kunnu has joined us now. Kunnu, the conversation where we left off, we've been having this conversation, Collins and I, and the question is, does this boil down to greed, looking at the Nelson Mandela example, or is it as a result of trying to finish an unfinished business?
Well, Sulai, when you talk about unfinished business, I don't think that there's anybody who would say that they are able to achieve virtually all they want to achieve in offices that do not belong to them. The office that people occupy when they become presidents or vice presidents belongs to the citizens. And I think it's gross misconception to think that they have unfinished business. You perhaps could say there is unfinished business in their private entrepreneurs or some kind of endeavors. But when it comes to the office that belongs to the people, no single person can actually round off anything. It has to be in continuum. And that is why it makes inconsequential the fact that you're talking about political parties, Sulai. Political parties often think that the person who succeed another for them has that particular right to finish some kind of tennis. But what is important here, Sulai, is that the people who occupy the offices must understand that the owners of the offices are the citizens that put them in power. So it means that if you're not able to do what you should do, they should step aside for somebody to either bring new ideas to strengthen things and administer the ship of state well, or perhaps they throw away every other person until they get the right person to do it. So the issue of unfinished business should never come in elective office. It should never come in. It's an aberration and a gross misconception. Having said that, Sulai, okay, I think you want to ask me a question. So having said that, basically, Sulai, it then means that people who get into elective office must understand that it is for you to put in the best you could within the time frame that the ground norm allows you to. And I also think that we should look inward. So let's look at what happened, for instance, in Mali, up until the man who was there got ousted by the military. Now, the person who is overseeing the country at the moment is an interim, and that person also is a retired military officer. The person who led the coup is assisting him. So you'd also look at how the military itself in respective African countries seems to misunderstand their position or their role as far as the administration of the state is concerned. If you left Mali and go to Egypt, Hosni Mubarak was a retired military officer. If you look at the person who preceded Hosni Mubarak,
well, I think we have a glitch there with the connection. Let me quickly take this to Collins. Collins, listening to Niyi, he used the word, he said the office belongs to the people. And before he joined us, we were trying to, see how the African type democracy can be a model. Perhaps if we take away the term limits or some of those ugly, overstayers actions that we've seen, is there a possibility? You have been studying, democracy around the continent. Is there a possibility that Africa can have a better democracy that the West, Europe and America, can actually, look towards?
Absolutely. The possibility is there. Of course, I do not believe in the notion of, copycat, syndrome, where, it is assumed that because a certain practice works in Europe or works in the United States of America, that it could be imported, wholesale to Africa. Yes, of course, certain concepts could be, imported to Africa with some room for adaptability that suits the African idiosyncrasies. Take, for example, this whole issue of, term limits. We have to understand that term limits vary along two core dimensions: the length of a term, and of course, the number of terms that a president can serve. All democracies set the length of the term a president may serve. In Africa, it ranges between, I would say, 4 and 7 years, while 37 states set terms of 5 years, a small number permit 4, 6, or 7 years. So these are the things to look at. But ultimately, I believe that we cannot be singing, our mouth can be full of the fact that we have regional bodies like the AU or the ECOWAS, yet when it really matters very well, they become, real example of a toothless bulldog. Now, that is not to say that I condemn in totality what they do, but when we talk about the whole idea of making Africa the beacon of democracy as it ought to be, this is where they actually come in. But what we have seen most of the time is lack of consensus and actually playing to the galleries of, some of these despotic leaders. Now, what has to happen if Africa really has to, begin to enjoy a democracy is for the normative nomenclature that has so far been developed by the African Union to now be used as basis that can, that can then encourage conversations within national borders and then harmonize them such that, when they say term limit has to take place, it has to be more or less uniform, and they should be willing and ready to step in at any point in time. Take, for example, military coup. We have known if they can succeed, the African Union and other regional body, if they can succeed in actually making coup d'etat unromantic, for want of a better word, as they have done in the last period. Of course, not with 100% success, but we can see that it is something that is declining.
Let me come in here and bring in Kunnu, and this will actually go to both of you, and it has to do with perhaps maybe there is a lost chance for the continent to have adopted something that would have been an African-type democracy. President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria once, suggested or mooted the idea of a single 6-term limit. If that had, gone through, would that have been, an ideal, way to start looking at Africa and its own type of democracy? I think we're having difficulty getting to hear you, Adeniyi, Kunnu. So I take this back to Collins, and I'm quite sure you heard me, Collins. Tell us your views on that.
Yes. It is certainly an option that has to be looked at. Like I mentioned, when I tried to do a paintbrush of what is existing currently and the two existing dimensions, you will see that there is either one straight, term of whatever number of years, or two terms that ends there. Sometimes you have a situation where two terms is two terms, and you don't take a break like Vladimir Putin did in Russia, and then come back after a while. These are all options, but I do believe that so far a system that has been tested, that have been tried and tested, is that system where you have two terms of say 4 years or 5 years, and that is for life. Now, the 6-year term, as Goodluck Jonathan, suggested and actually tried to promote, is indeed an option, but it is not the be-all and end-all of that conversation.
Well, third termism, as it has been otherwise called, has become one of Africa's biggest problems from our conversations from both of you gentlemen. Just when you thought it should be totally condemned, many think it's a move in the right direction if true development will be achieved. So the next opinion is yours, and you have to make it when it's time to vote your leaders. A good place to wrap it up on today's show. Many thanks for being such a nice company. Collins, Nweke, and of course Adeniyi Kunnu. Well, I hope we can have this conversation some other time. Many thanks. And don't forget, you can watch us live at newscentraltv.africa and on YouTube at youtube.com/newscentraltv. I'm Sulaiman. See you again tomorrow.